The movement I chose is throwing a football. In this picture, you can see our starting point for our movement. All the movements I'm about to name are going to be an isometric contraction due to the fact that the muscles are contracting to hold my arm in this position. The first part of the upper extremity we are going to look at is the shoulder girdle. The first movement is scapular retraction. The muscles that perform this contraction is the rhomboids, the upper middle and lower trapezius. The scapula is also in downward rotation. This is performed by the rhomboids, levator scapula, and the pectoralis minor. The next movement is scapular elevation. This movement is performed by the upper and middle trapezius, levator scapula, and the rhomboids. The last movement seen in this picture for the shoulder girdle is scapular tilt. The muscle that performs this movement is the pectoralis minor. The next part of the upper extremity we are going to look at in this picture is the shoulder joint. The first movement is extension. The muscles that perform this contraction are the posterior deltoid, latissimus dorsi, teres major, and the sternal portion of the pectoralis major. The next movement is lateral rotation. The infraspinatus, teres minor, and posterior deltoid contract to hold this position. At the elbow is flexed, and the forearm is in a neutral position. The biceps brachii, brachialis, and brachioradialis contract to keep the elbow flexed. When looking at the wrist is an extension and radial deviation. To keep the wrist in extension, the extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis, as well as the extensor carpi ulnaris, contract. To keep the wrist in radial deviation, the extensor carpi radialis longus contracts. The last portion of the upper extremity is the hand. The first movement is adduction of the thumb. This is occurring due to the contraction of the adductor pollicis. The next movement is slight flexion of the thumb. The flexor pollicis longus and flexor pollicis brevis contract to hold the thumb in this position. There is also flexion of the fingers. The flexor digitorum profundus, flexor digitorum superciliaris, and the flexor digiti minimi contract to hold the fingers in this position. The last thing shown in this picture for isometric contraction is abduction of the fingers. The dorsal interossei and the abductor digiti minimi contract to hold the fingers in abduction. In this picture, you are able to see the ending point of our movement. I am going to talk about all the concentric contractions that occurred to allow our arm to go from the starting position to this position. Starting at the shoulder girdle, the serratus anterior and the pectoralis minor contract to move the arm into protraction. The upper, middle, and lower trapezius, as well as the serratus anterior, contract to move the arm into slight upward rotation. The scapula moves into an anterior tilt because of the contraction of the pectoralis minor. Looking at the shoulder joint, the anterior deltoid, coracobrachialis, and clavicular portion of the pectoralis minor contract to move the arm into shoulder flexion. The latissimus dorsi, teres major, subscapularis, pectoralis major, and anterior deltoid contract to medially rotate the arm. At the elbow and the forearm, the triceps brachii contract to extend the elbow. The pronator teres, pronator quadratus, and the brachioradialis contract to move the arm into pronation. When looking at the wrist, the flexor carpi ulnaris contracts to move the wrist into ulnar deviation. The flexor carpi ulnaris, as well as the flexor digitorum profundus, contract to move the wrist into flexion. At the hand, the extensor indicis and the extensor digiti minimi and lumbrical muscles contract to move the fingers into extension. The palmar interossei contracts to move the fingers into adduction. As my arm slowly moves to throw the football, you are able to see my arm move farther into lateral rotation. The infraspinatus, teres minor, and posterior deltoid concentrically contract to bring my arm further back before I start my throw. As I throw the ball, you are able to see my shoulder move into flexion, protraction, and slight upward rotation. My arm then immediately rotates as my elbow goes into extension and pronation. As I release the ball, my wrist goes into flexion and ulnar deviation. My fingers then extend and adduct.